The fact is, black voters matter. Like, you know how James Carville said, is the economy stupid? Like, it's black voters stupid. Like, it's not rocket science. Rural voters matter. We saw that, and we saw rural voters, and this is what's going to happen in Michigan when you.
Democratic Socialists are once again becoming a major point of debate within the Democratic Party, and this CNN panel gets heated over whether their recent primary performances represent a rejection of progressive politics or evidence that the movement is actually gaining momentum. In this clip, Barry Sellers and Scott Jennings clash over black and rural voters, candidate electability, and whether Democrats should embrace progressive policies or continue relying on establishment candidates. Now, if you're new here, I'm Bradley Hostin, and this is The Bradley Hostin Show. If you enjoy honest political commentary, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's get into it.
Good evening. I'm Lulu Garcia-Navarro in for Abby Phillip. Turns out talk of canceling holidays isn't popular with voters. Who knew? The progressive left licking their wounds after a swing and a miss in battleground Wisconsin. And it's raising questions tonight about who voters really want. In the state's Democratic primary for governor, the establishment-backed David Crowley narrowly defeated Francesca Hong, a Democratic Socialist. Hong was hoping to capitalize on a string of recent progressive wins across the country, and all signs pointed towards her victory. But she spent the final weeks of her campaign facing questions about her past controversial statements and even reversed course on a 2020 social media post in which she called for canceling Thanksgiving.
But Thanksgiving is also a time that's incredibly painful for many people in our communities. And so I think I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are multiple views.
My favorite holiday is Thanksgiving. Because I
There you have it.
Thanksgiving. Yep. I don't want to cancel it. I actually love it.
Crowley's victory is a stunning upset that opens a new chapter in the ongoing battle for the identity of the Democratic Party. Listen to how Jon Stewart framed the missed opportunities.
When you don't know the difference between Chuck Schumer and Mamdani, and you don't know how to square that circle, and you don't have anybody who can unify that message, how the they haven't come up with their own contract for America, or even if it's a gimmick to centralize the general complaints of a public thirsty for some actionable ideas and leadership, is malpractice bordering on criminal.
Before we open it up to the table here, we invite you at home to join the debate. Head to cnn.com/Abby and weigh in. We'll get to some of your comments throughout the show. But Bakari, I'm going to start with you because I'm assuming that you are going to say, I told you so, or something to this effect.
Yeah, first of all, it's not a stunning upset. And I kind of push back on that narrative. I think that we do a couple of things which are just incorrect. First, we label DSA and progressives all in one category, and that's just fundamentally inaccurate. You have a lot of progressives that don't espouse the same views and are not in the same political party as DSA. That's first. Second, it's not an upset. The recipe has been the same. And what we saw last night in Wisconsin is the same thing that we saw in Detroit to a lesser extent, but we've seen it throughout the South where DSA has been rejected. The fact is, black voters matter. Like, you know how James Carville said, is the economy stupid? Like, it's black voters stupid. Like, it's not rocket science. Rural voters matter. We saw that, and we saw rural voters, and this is what's going to happen in Michigan when you look at Abdul, is the simple fact that he did extremely poorly with black voters. He did extremely poorly with rural voters. Right now, DSA is a party that's centralized with suburban white voters who have a certain upper crest, and it's in New York and it's in the Pacific Northwest. They haven't been able to cross that hump, and so we spent a lot of time trying to make this a mainstream type argument, and it's simply not that. And you saw the repudiation of that last night. And honestly,
but was it just that she was a weaker candidate?
No.
I mean,
Abdul is a political animal.
I just wonder if this is not just that
he's a political athlete and she is not. And you
was known for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are missing the story here. It's not that she lost; it's that weak candidate without any establishment support, almost won. She got 39% of the votes in Wisconsin. Okay, and that's not the state where the DSA is supposed to win. And but for those stumbles in the final weeks, she would have won. And that is the trend. It's not that she didn't win the race. It's that message, that progressive, whatever it is, message is gaining steam even in Wisconsin compared to yesterday, compared to last year, and will continue to gain steam. And in effect, she didn't lose because of the message. She lost because voters questioned her electability.
Yeah, I mean,
and so the message is actually on the rise. So I think if Democrats were smart, they would pay attention to the fact that she came within 0.5 points of becoming the nominee.
And did it without AOC and did it without Bernie Sanders. You could make an argument had they engaged with their fellow socialists.
But I mean,
she would have won.
The larger message for Democrats is like, don't be weird. Like that simply, like on simple issues, like let's not have candidates, because for a long period of time we ran circles around Republicans in terms of candidate quality. I can literally remember the days of Todd Aiken. I can remember the days of Catherine O'Donnell saying, "I am not a witch," right? And I know who Ken Paxton is. Like I've seen the corruption surrounding Ken Paxton. We cannot run candidates who fundamentally are not ready.
I mean, the Nazi tattoo alleged rapist guy, that was a bad idea.
One second.
Correct. And we repudiated
But eventually,
One second. Bakari.
Yes, ma'am.
I just to interrupt. That sounds fine, I think. But the fact of the matter is that she was running against someone who literally just came in 3 weeks ago and running against a divided group of people. And so, this was not a very concerted effort to take her down. And so what you're seeing here is, I think, a very divided Democratic Party.
No, I mean, you want it to be that because that's a better story. What you're seeing is the same thing we've seen over and over again, which is fundamentally DSA candidates do not do well in rural communities. They do not do well with black voters, point blank, period. They have not been able to win in the South. They actually had an election, and Abdul is not necessarily a DSA candidate, but we saw the repudiation of black voters. We saw the repudiation of rural voters. I mean, that is what you'll see continuously. Until you make inroads in those communities, you're not going to win Democratic primaries.
Abdul's got Thanksgiving problems. 2019. Just a reminder, this Thanksgiving, this country was built on the systematic annihilation of indigenous peoples whose ancestors suffer some of the highest rates of homelessness, joblessness, and mortality. We owe so much more than thanks. Time for reparations. So the problem with
the facts.
That's actually a true sentiment.
The problem with don't be weird is that all these socialist or socialist adjacent or communist adjacent or whatever candidates all spent a fair number of years tweeting weird things that put them in the same bucket as Hong. You said he's a political animal. He's got a lot of the same beliefs. He's got a lot of the same beliefs. He's more nuanced. But
I will tell you this, Scott. He has work to do. Then when if we want to say, oh my God, DSA is making inroads because of what happened in Wisconsin with the election, you have to realize that over 50% of voters in Michigan, they didn't vote for Abdul Saeed.
Well, Bakari, I think it's interesting. You're talking a lot about where black voters are going, and we're seeing Abdullah Saeed needs to make more of an effort for that because Mike Rogers is making a play for more moderate voters. And I kind of reject your notion that you think essentially more establishment Democrats are going to continue to lead the party. That's simply not true, especially because we're seeing the Democratic Party is basically absorbing all of the far left ideas that the DSA is putting forward. And so even the so-called moderate who won isn't really moderate. He doesn't want to work with federal law enforcement, ICE. He wants an open border. He wants all of these very far left things. So, he's just not quite as crazy because he doesn't want to cancel Thanksgiving. I think that's the question. Even if he isn't DSA, they're still absorbing far left ideas, and I think that's going to repel.
Let's actually say if we want to make sure that everybody has access to quality health care or first-class education, or we want to take Mamdani approaches to affordability, things that matter to people,
like rent hitting a new all-time high.
Then that's something. That's something that people actually care about. I'm talking about the fact is people aren't necessarily talking about defunding the police. If you want to talk about ICE, we'll talk about that a little later. But to say
lots of people are talking about defunding the police, like Abdul Sayed.
I'm saying that moderate voters, the voters you're talking about, pragmatic voters, Democrats are not necessarily looking for the next great messiah. What we're looking for is someone who can win. What we're looking for is we're tired of losing elections, particularly in November when our rights are on the ballot.
But the I will say, Wisconsin voters got it right by factoring in electability when it came to this race, because like Ron Johnson himself said it, that this is now a more formidable opponent that they will be facing this November, because Francesca Hong, she did have candidate quality issues. And so we can argue about the DSA and whether it's making more of an impact and whether that Democratic voters want candidates like that in rural or urban areas. But I will say, though, that I think that voters in Wisconsin, these Democratic primary voters, recognize the threat that is Tom Tiffany and electing him as governor. Because if we have a disputed presidential election in 2028, it's going to be governors like him who are making decisions about that election. And so it is important that we're not putting up an election denier to fill that governor
There
seat.
was another election on Tuesday. It was in Minnesota, and the socialist over in Minnesota, Peggy Flanagan.
She's not a socialist.
Okay, the radical lunatic Peggy Flanagan decided she won over the moderate Craig. I mean, that did happen in a state with a lot of rural voters, and so the socialists.
Hold on one second. This speaks to the conflation that's happening that you hear, that everyone is now a socialist when we're talking about Democrats. But actually, Lydia, I want to ask you something, because if you look right now at Mayor Mamdani, who is the most famous Democratic Socialist, his approval rating is going up, which is unprecedented. I mean, if you look here, 45% in June, now 47%. New York City, 58%, now 69% in New York City. He is trying to show that democratic socialism is actually something that can work. How do you explain that?
Look, it's a good question. I think he was a very skilled marketer, which is why he got into the mayoral office in the first place, and he's continuing to do that. He's very good at the photo ops. But if you look at the numbers, those are telling a completely different story. Rents are at a new all-time high. So I think eventually the data and the reality of the policies he's implementing are going to catch up with him.
I do think, though, that there are New Yorkers who are happy with him, not because he's a member of the Democratic Socialist Party. They're happy with him because he was talking about affordability and addressing their top priorities. They're happy with him because he's following through on campaign promises. You look at filling potholes or fixing drinking fountains. These are things that New Yorkers care about.
He fixed one drinking fountain, and it's because somebody tagged him on Instagram to do that. A functioning government doesn't need somebody to be tagged on Instagram to fix something.
I talked to a lot of young Democrats and young progressives, and they all say the exact same thing. They say that they're dissatisfied with the leadership of the Democratic Party because the grievances that underpinned those tweets and statements in 2020 have not been addressed by Democratic leaders 6 years later. And those grievances were real, and people forget that we had on the left the biggest protest movement of the century in 2020, and it was based on real grievances, and none of those have been addressed. So people who speak to those grievances will win inside the Democratic Party, and people who show results on those grievances.
It's also generational, and we're seeing
it is generational.
We're seeing a lot of that as well, but we're seeing it across party.
All right,
and
everybody.
And that's going to matter in 2028, and Democrats ignore it to their peril.
All right, everybody stand by.
So honestly, this was a fascinating discussion, because I think both sides were making arguments that deserve to be examined. But there was definitely one thing that really frustrated me. When it comes to democratic socialists, I keep hearing the same argument. They're too radical. They can't win black voters. They can't win rural voters. And they're not electable. Okay, but then I have to ask a very simple question. What exactly are Democrats supposed to do differently? Because if the establishment has had years and years to deliver for working Americans and people are still struggling with healthcare, housing, education, and affordability, then why should voters automatically trust the establishment to fix those problems? And this is where I think the conversation about policy gets completely lost. Universal health care, tuition-free public college, student debt relief, stronger labor rights, higher minimum wages, affordable housing, and making wealthy individuals pay more in taxes, those aren't automatically unpopular ideas simply because they're associated with democratic socialism. You can disagree with the policies. That's perfectly legitimate. But let's actually debate the policies. And I also think Bari made an important point about black and rural voters. If progressive candidates want to win Democratic primaries and eventually general elections, they absolutely have to build a coalition beyond wealthy suburban and urban voters. That's just reality, but I don't think that means Democrats should abandon progressive policies. It means they need to learn how to communicate those policies to people who don't necessarily identify as progressive. And then there's the Wisconsin race. What really stood out to me was the different way the media appears to be framing these results. When Abdul El-Sayed won, the narrative became about how close the election was and whether his victory represented a broader progressive movement. But when Francesca Hong came within a very narrow margin of winning without the same level of establishment support, suddenly we're hearing that progressives were rejected. Well, which one is it? If a progressive candidate almost wins without significant establishment backing, surely that tells us something too. And that's why I think dismissing these candidates simply because they're labeled socialist is a mistake. Look at what voters are actually responding to. People want someone who talks about affordability. They want health care they can afford. They want housing they can afford. They want wages that allow them to live a decent life. And if a candidate can convince voters that they're actually going to deliver those things, then voters are going to listen. That's exactly why I think the discussion about Mamdani is important as well. You can criticize him. You can disagree with him. You can question whether his policies are financially sustainable. But if his popularity is increasing because voters believe he's actually delivering on the issues they care about, then Democrats need to understand why that's happening instead of simply dismissing the movement as radical. And this is where I think the Democratic Party has a decision to make. Do they continue trying to recreate the same establishment politics that have failed to inspire large sections of their own electorate? Or do they actually listen to the voters who are demanding something different? Because one thing is becoming increasingly clear to me. People are tired of being told to vote for someone simply because they're not the other guy. They want something to vote for. And if Democrats can figure that out, they could have a very different political future. Let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments section below. Do you think Democratic Socialists are actually gaining momentum? Or do you think these recent results prove that Democrats still need more moderate and establishment candidates? As usual, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more news commentaries. I'll see you guys in the next one.